All right, folks. So today we are doing chapter 10. And with chapter 10, that means that we are two-thirds of the way through this course. We spoke about political parties last chapter in chapter 9. And today we're looking at interest groups and lobbying and how they impact our government. So, interest groups are going to be groups of people that are organized to pursue a common interest by applying pressure on the political process to influence government decision making and public policy. So, what they're going to do is they are going to lobby or try and tell our government what they want to see our government accomplish. They're going to monitor government activity. So, let's say we have a lobbyist or a group that is lobbying for changes in climate change, regulations on, say, greenhouse gases, and they're able to get Congress to pass legislation that is going to reduce greenhouse gases. Once that legislation is passed, their job isn't done. They're going to continue to monitor the bureaucracy, the government agency that's responsible for implementing that new law to make sure that it's implemented in the manner in which it was intended or in a manner in which would be most favorable to that particular interest group. Interest groups also provide us, the common Americans, a way to express our opinions to our government. It's one thing for one of us to call up our elected official and say, hey, this is what I think. It's another for an interest group with, say, 500,000 people as members to call up a politician and say, hey, our 500,000 members feel this way. We think you should vote this way on a particular piece of legislation or on a bill. Um, it's also a way for the public, you and I, and our lawmakers to get information. As we're going to talk about later in the lecture, our lobbyists generally are experts in the area that they lobby on. A lot of times they're experts on Congress and our government and how things operate. And so they're able to help our elected officials not only educate themselves on what laws are beneficial and not beneficial, but also how to actually get that legislation passed. So political parties was last week. Today's interest groups. One major distinction between the two is they both want to influence how our government is operating. They both want to have a say in what laws and policies are being passed. But political parties are trying to do that by controlling the government. They want to win elections, put people in place to make sure that their party platforms, their policies are actually implemented. Interest groups, however, aren't interested in controlling our government. They don't want to put candidates into office necessarily. They're there to try and simply just influence our government. So while they're both trying to influence the government, one is doing it by trying to control the government, and the other one just wants to have their voice and opinions heard. Let's review question number 1. What is the difference between an interest group and a political party? Okay. All right. So when we look at interest groups, there are several different types. These are probably the more important interest groups or the more powerful interest groups that currently exist. The first one is going to be our business groups, and these are going to include things like the Chambers of Commerce, the Alliance for Better Business. Their goal is going to be focused on making a profit for the groups or the constituency that they represent. So they're going to want to make sure that the cities that they are operating in or that they are in are going to have laws that are favorable to the different businesses. They're going to want to make sure that the tax laws, are not oppressive for the business so they can continue to thrive. Here in Whittier, we have our Whittier City Chamber of Commerce. We have our Uptown Whittier's Association, and we saw them really influence our government during the COVID-19 pandemic. When we saw in Uptown Whittier, if you were familiar with Whittier and were around on Greenleaf Avenue, when all the restaurants and the beauty salons and everything else were required to close, we saw the Whittier Uptown Association lobbying the Whittier city government to allow them to do build outs into the street. And for several years, they did. They closed off parking spots on the street itself and allowed the restaurants to build out into the streets so that they can continue operating during the pandemic. All right. We see some powerful companies such as like Exxon or Google actually create an interest group all by themselves. So instead of well, they still belong to like the Chamber of Commerce and those different groups, but they also have an interest group that is specifically their own and is there to lobby for their interests exclusively. We see that business groups seldom unite on one side of an issue or another. A lot of times they sort of kind of ride that middle line in supporting both candidates with the hope that once they get elected into office, they will make decisions that are favorable to them. We also have professional groups, and the professional groups are going to be the professional organizations like the American Medical Association, the National Association of Realtors, the American Bar Association. These professional groups have powerful, powerful lobbyists in Washington, and they're constantly lobbying to make sure that these professions can continue to thrive, that they can continue to remain profitable, and that they continue to restrict the amount of liability or the times when they can be sued or held accountable for their actions. All right. Labor unions, these labor unions basically are the most generally typically support the Democratic Party. So you'll see the most funding for the Democratic Party coming from labor unions. But examples of labor unions would be like the California Teachers Association, the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, Screen Actors Guild, United Steelworkers. Labor unions essentially are representatives for the employees of a particular industry or from a particular employer. Here at Rio Hondo, we have our own labor union as well. It's called the Rio Hondo College Faculty Association, and they're the ones that lobby for better pay for our faculty. They lobby for our health care. They lobby for working conditions and those sorts of things to make sure that our rights are protected here at the college. We also have agricultural interests that act as interest groups. We're looking at like the American Farm Bureau Association, the United Farmers Union, the National Grange, and they're going to be lobbying our government to ensure that the farms are able to remain profitable. If there are years where there's a drought or something else happening, then they're going to be lobbying our government for maybe subsidies from the government to make sure that the farmers can continue to operate their farms, pay their employees, pay their mortgages, those sorts of things. All right, so we see interest groups can be organized by several different ways. There are interest groups that are organized by ethnic, social, political concerns. And here's a couple of examples of them we have here for you. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and the Urban League, they are both focused on economic and religious constituencies within the African American communities. The Black Lives Matter movement really took off, and it's been around for a while, but took off in 2020 after the murder of George Floyd. And their goal is to eradicate white supremacy in the United States. They intervene on violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and by vigilantes. We also have the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC, and they advocate for the close ties between the United States and Israel. They attempt to influence our government, our policies, when it comes to policies that we are passing regarding the Middle East. We also see interest groups organized by similar social political ideas. The Sierra Club is one that lobbies to protect our environment. Greenpeace takes direct action on environmental issues. So not only do they lobby, but they're actually out there, in the oceans trying to prevent, farming, fish farming, and those sorts of things. We have the Tea Party, that is a populist conservative movement that wants to reduce the size of our federal budget deficit, so how much money we owe, and reduce the size of our government as well. We have organizations like PETA, which is People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. They're a nonprofit corporation that's funded by its members. They oppose things like factory farming, animal testing, cruelty to pets, and those sorts of different issues. Now, lobbying is what interest groups do. And what lobbying is when individuals, businesses, or interest groups put pressure on the government to act in their favor. How they'll accomplish this, a lot of times they hire lobbyists, or they'll have someone represent them represent their organization before the government. A lot of lobbyists now are lobbying groups maintain professional staffs. So they have full-time staffs or lobbyists that are lobbying our government actively. If they don't have their own staff, then they'll hire a consulting firm to handle lobbying on their behalf. When we look at who these lobbyists are, a lot of them are going to be former members of Congress or former members of the executive branch or their support staff, because they know how the process works, because they have been part of the government. They know how legislation gets passed. They know which committees are likely to favorably vote on legislation. They know which politicians are likely to support it. They know which politicians are willing to make compromises in exchange for support for their type of legislation as well. So lobbyists, when they come in and they lobby our interest groups, they're helping our elected officials accomplish their job by partially by telling them how to do the actual job. We see lobbyists come in very different forms. We have membership organizations, and membership organizations are ones that individuals voluntarily join. They pay dues to be part of this organization, and then that organization lobbies on their behalf. So organizations like PETA, Greenpeace, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, are good examples of membership organizations. Here at Rio Hondo, our Rio Hondo College Faculty Association is also a membership organization. Faculty here at Rio Hondo have the option of opting out of being represented by the union here, but most faculty are members and pay dues. We also see that there are in-house lobbyists, and these are lobbyists that worked for one interest group or for a firm. So they are on their permanent staff and they're out there basically advocating for that particular firm or interest group on a regular basis. We have contract lobbyists. So say, for example, a particular industry or a company has an issue that they're concerned about, and it's a temporary issue that needs to be addressed. Instead of bringing in an in-house lobbyist as a permanent position, they'll bring in a contract lobbyist, someone just to go and advocate for the one or two particular issues. And once they're done, their contract is up. And then we have what we call legislative liaisons. And legislative liaisons are actually employees by the government employees that are lobbying Congress to get things accomplished for them, like additional funding, additional staffing, or those sorts of things. Here at Rio Hondo, we have our own legislative liaison. They are called the Office of Government and Community Relations, and they're the ones that are responsible for reaching out to our state government, to the federal government, to ensure that we have our needs here at Rio Hondo addressed, that we have funding. If there is something going on campus that needs to, support of the government, they're the ones reaching out to the government requesting that support. So lobbying can take place in one of two ways. We have what we call outside lobbying, and instead of our lobbyists directly contacting our government officials or the members of our bureaucracy, they're coming to us, you and I, the public, and trying to get their message out. The reason they do that is they come to us because they want us to feel a certain way about a particular issue. So say, for example, the National Rifle Association, there's legislation in front of Congress that's going to restrict the ability of individuals to own guns. The National Rifle Association is going to go out to their members and to, the general public and let them know what Congress is considering, let them know why that's a bad idea, and then they're going to tell them the ways in which they can contact their congressional representatives or how they can influence the government. So instead of them going in and directly lobbying, which they're also going to do, they get us, the public, to go and lobby on their behalf or contact our elected representatives and let them know how we feel about a certain issue. We also have inside lobbying, and this is more quiet. It takes place generally in congressional committees or within the executive branches of the bureaucracies. And it's basically where the lobbyists are talking to our elected officials, talking to their staff, talking to the members of the bureaucracy, and telling them what they want to have accomplished or what should be accomplished. This takes place behind closed doors. We don't have access to those meetings. We don't have minutes from those meetings. So we, the public, don't know what's actually happening in those meetings. But basically, they're trying to accomplish the goals of their interest groups. All right. So lecture review question number, that's wrong, should be question number 2, sorry. How does outside lobbying accomplish the goals of the interest groups? How does reaching out to us, the public, get what they want done? Okay. So if we look at lobbying by industry, what we've seen is at times both political parties have promised reform and more transparency in lobbying. The amount of money being spent on our government to try and influence our government is astronomical. So during the election years, during campaigns and those sorts of things, we've seen both Republicans and Democrats say that they're going to be more transparent in lobbying. They're going to restrict the amount of money being used to influence our government. What we've seen, though, is that hasn't always played out the way that we want it to. And so when we look at lobbying by industry and how much different industries themselves are spending lobbying and influencing our government, these numbers are quite high. In 2020, The pharmaceutical and health products industry in the United States spent the most on lobbying our government. Remember, 2020 was a COVID-19 pandemic. We saw vaccines being produced. We saw PPD, those sorts of things being in high demand. That year they spent about $306 million trying to impact our government themselves. The same year we saw the insurance industries spend about 151 million US dollars on lobbying as well. Now, thousands of companies hired lobbyists for thousands of companies and organizations hired lobbyists for the first time in 2020, simply because they had never needed it before. But once the pandemic hit, the needs of our society and the needs of our country changed. We had more than 3,700 companies and other groups that spent no money lobbying our government in 2019, then went on to hire lobbyists in 2020. So we saw a huge spike in the number of lobbyists being employed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. When we look at the amount of money that's being spent lobbying our government, it correlates to some of the decisions that our government's making. When we look at the price of things like insulin here in the United States, which continues to increase and has not really been decreased or capped for a really long time, and we look at how much money was being spent by pharmaceutical companies to lobby our government, it makes sense. They're the ones spending money trying to convince our government to not cap prices on certain medications. And then we see our government not doing that action, which actually is detrimental to us, the public, but benefits those lobbying groups that have been basically putting all this money into lobbying them. Since we came out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that a lot of companies have continued to pay their lobbyists, continue to have these, continue to pay to have this influence over our government. We saw that manufacturers, unions, financial companies, and technologies firms spent significantly more in 2021 lobbying our government than they ever had in the past years. The cruise lines were shut down for more than a year during the pandemic. We had the problem with the COVID-19 pandemic was so contagious and COVID-19 virus was so contagious and spread so quickly that the cruise lines were basically turning into super spreader events. So Congress decided to shut down the cruise lines for a period of a year to try and control the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. What we saw was that in response to that, the cruise lines then spent 100 times more in 2020 lobbying than they did in 2019. We saw Norwegian Cruise Line, which is one of the big ones, hired 2 new lobbying firms and spent $1 million in 2020, when in 2019 they spent $10,000. They lobbied Congress, they lobbied the White House, they lobbied the Centers for Disease Control over the suspension of cruise lines. When they started to reopen the cruise lines, they lobbied them about what their requirements, what guidelines they were going to be. Were they going to require social distancing? What infection or disinfecting procedures were going to be required? Those sorts of things. They also lobbied for that American Rescue Plan. If you remember, it was a huge financial package that provided relief to a lot of our industries and our workers. There was about $1.9 trillion in funds that came through the American Rescue Plan. It was the 3rd stimulus bill, and so the cruise lines lobbied to make sure that they were included in that stimulus package. Another cruise operator, Carnival, spent more than $1 million in both years of the pandemic, so 2020 and 2021, lobbying for appropriations. They're lobbying for pandemic-related job losses. They spent 59% more in 2021 than they did in 2019. Beginning in March of 2021, we saw the cruise supporters for the outside lobbying, where they contacted the people that like to go on cruises and said, "Hey, help us." Sent more than 155,000 messages to Congress, trying to encourage them to reopen the cruise industry and to reduce the regulations. The first cruise that was allowed to depart since the pandemic did it in June of 2022. And since then, we've seen more than 2 million passengers return to the cruise lines themselves. Now, one of the reasons why the cruise line spent so much money lobbying our government was because in the initial 2 aid packages, well, the first one that was approved in 2020, they basically were left out of those aid packages, which means they didn't get stimulus money to help pay their employees. They didn't give money to make sure that their businesses didn't fail. And so it was really important for them to hire these lobbyists to ensure that they were receiving monies as well, and trying to make sure that their industries didn't fail because they weren't allowed to operate. Now, the government has what we call the iron triangle, and it's a phrase that's used by political scientists to describe the relationship between politics, our Congress, and our bureaucracy. So we haven't talked about the bureaucracy or Congress yet, and we're going to get to that in the next couple of chapters. But Congress is a branch of of the government, our legislative branch, and they're the ones that pass the laws. So when you see tax laws being passed, when you see appropriations bills, money being spent here, laws being passed, Congress, not the president, is the one actually passing those laws. Now, the bureaucracy is part of the executive branch and they work underneath our president. So their job is to actually implement those laws that Congress has passed. So Congress passes the laws, the bureaucracy is the one that implements them. And then the interest group also here on the other side of the triangle, they're trying to influence Congress and influence our bureaucracy and what laws are being passed and how those laws are being implemented. So this triangle shows how that symbiotic relationship between the interest groups, Congress, and the bureaucracy works to accomplish the goals of all three. So if we start down here with the interest groups, let's say they want something to get passed. Let's say here in California, we want a plastic straw ban because we think it's damaging the oceans and it's hurting, the fish and the turtles and the seals and everyone else off the coast of California. So we want a plastic straw ban. So our interest group is going to go to Congress and we're going to say, hey, we really think you should pass this ban on plastic straws. What they're going to tell them is, this is why it's important to pass the ban. This is how you're going to pass this ban. You're going to talk to this congressional member, that congressional member. This is how the process works. And in exchange for passing this ban or supporting this ban, we're going to tell the members of our interest group to vote for you. We're going to say, hey, this candidate, believes in what we believe in, has supported our issues. Vote for him. And we're also going to give you electoral support in the form of campaign contributions. So we might give money directly to your reelection campaigns. We might give money to your home constituencies for projects that will make you look good. And so the member of Congress is like, okay, this sounds great. I think, we need to protect the wildlife off the coast of California. I need some electoral support. So I'm going to support this plastic straw ban. So they pass this, and then this legislation gets given to the bureaucracy. Now, for the bureaucracy to be able to implement this law, they're going to need resources. So they're going to need financial support. They're going to need money allocated into the congressional budget for this particular action. They're going to need, the support of our elected officials in promoting this policy. So the bureaucracy gets this piece of legislation. They get the money from Congress, they get the support from Congress, and then they implement this plastic straw ban. And so now the interest group has gotten what it wants as well. So throughout this process, our congressional members got electoral support, our bureaucracy got financial support and funding, and our interest group got exactly what it wanted. Now, the iron triangle can start at any one of the 3 points. It doesn't have to start with the interest groups. So say, for example, someone in the bureaucracy, let's say the IRS, decides that we need to streamline our tax forms to make it easier for Americans to file taxes and to make it easier for them to process the tax returns and get them back to us quickly. So the bureaucracy decides, okay, we want we want to change the tax forms, but we need Congress's approval to modify how that's going to happen. So the bureaucracy goes to Congress and says, this is what we need to happen. We need you to enact this policy or this law to help, make taxes easier for the Americans to file and for the bureaucracy to actually process. And Congress says, well, okay, but why should I do that? And what the bureaucracy is going to say is, look, we're telling you how to do it. We're telling you how to make it easier. And it's going to make you look good with the interest groups because you're going to make, the process more efficient for them. So Congress passes that friendly legislation, it goes down, and when it gets passed, it then benefits the interest groups that have been lobbying Congress to get this type of support all along. So the iron triangle goes both ways around the triangle, and it can start at any one point. All right, so now let's review question number 3. How are interest groups beneficial to our government? How in that iron triangle are they benefiting Congress? How are they benefiting the bureaucracy? Okay, so if we look at the number of registered active lobbyists in the United States from the years 2000 to 2023. So basically this chart goes over a 22-year period from 2000 to 2022, sorry. We see that the number of lobbyists has fluctuated a little bit. They peaked in 2008. They started to go down. We see in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president, that was the lowest number we had of lobbyists. And now in 2022, 2 years into the Biden administration, the numbers are starting to creep back up. In 2022, we had 12,644 registered active lobbyists in the United States, which means there were about 12,500 people actively lobbying our government to get their agendas, to get their needs addressed. So if we look at those numbers, that's a lot of people trying to influence our 435 members of the House of Representatives, our 100 members of the Senate, our president, our executive bureaucracies, going in and trying to impact what our government does. When we look at who the lobbyists are, what we see is there are no minimum qualifications for a lobbyist. So unlike our members of Congress, where you have to be a certain age and they have to live in the district and those sorts of things, our lobbyists are private actors. So there's no minimum requirements. Typically what we see for lobbyists to be successful, they often require a degree in their whatever area they're lobbying in. A lot of times they'll require a couple of years of experience in their careers before they're able to lobby. We see lots of former government employees acting as lobbyists because they've already got the experience with how to get legislation passed. And they've also got the inside contacts inside Congress, inside the executive branch to try and get legislation passed and laws implemented. Lobbyists are required to register with their state and federal governments so that the government can keep track of how many people are actively trying to lobby our government, and who those individuals are. Typical degrees that we see for lobbyists are going to be social policy, business studies, law, language, public relation, politics. Lobbyists obviously need to have a good understanding of the legislative process so that they can help our legislators pass bills. Currently, there are 468 former members of Congress, so people that either were Congress members or their support staff who are registered to act as lobbyists for our government. Family members as well as former members of our government can actively lobby the government. So it doesn't matter that maybe your spouse is currently a sitting Supreme Court member or your spouse is the president. There's no restrictions on family members not being able to lobby our government. So we have the gentleman you see here is before your time probably, but this is former Senator Bob Doyle. He has served, and I have his employment history up here for you to take a look at where he served at. So he was in the Army. He served at the state level at the state of Kansas. He served at the county level in Russell County in Kansas. He then went on to the U.S. House of Representatives. He's been in the Senate, and in the Senate, he's served on all these different committees like agriculture, tax, intelligence, rules and administration. And then from there, when he retired from government service in the late 1990s, he then went on to become a lobbyist. And so he's worked for several different lobbying firms. The most recently one was Alston and Bird. And as a former senator, as a former member of the House of Representatives, he had a lot of contacts and influence over our government as well. In 2002, he opened his own lobbying firm, but now works for Alstrom and Bird, another company. They represent 44 associations from all sectors, including healthcare, insurance, education, oil, gas, and retail. In the first 3 months of 2023, they reported almost $2 million in income from lobbying activity. So we have this idea of what we call the revolving door. And the revolving door are government regulators, congressional staff, and former members of Congress who take jobs with lobbying firms in the private sector after they leave government service. So essentially they work for the government, they know the ins and outs of the government, how legislation gets done, they have the connections, and then they go and work as lobbyists a lot of times for the firms that they were, that were lobbying them while they were holding office. So we call these revolvers because they leave government service and then they revolve back into being a part of lobbying the government as part of an interest group. So what we see is former members of Congress or elected representatives are not allowed to be a revolver for a period of a year after they leave government service. So you can't, one day be working as a Congress member passing legislation, and then once your term is up, turn around and go work for that company that you were just passing legislation for. That's not going to be allowed. But the members of their staff are allowed to, the congressional support, the members of the bureaucracy don't have that same restriction on them. So basically, they're going to have access. And one of the concerns with having revolvers, former members of Congress as revolvers, is that they have access that the everyday public doesn't have. If you were a member of Congress, even though you have left your position, you still have access to the dining areas in Congress, the gyms, the cloakrooms, the floor of Congress. So you're able to get to members of Congress to speak to them in a way that someone who has not been a member of Congress cannot. There's also the concern with the revolving door of if you're leaving government service, you're going to be looking for where your next job is going to be. You're going to be seeking employment. So the concern is if I know that I'm not going to go for reelection, say in 2 years when my term as a senator is up, I'm still going to be thinking about what I'm going to be doing for employment in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. So what's to stop me from passing legislation that's favorable to a particular lobbying industry or an employer with the aim of trying to work for that lobbying group once I leave Congress? So in 2019, there was a bipartisan effort to try and stop revolvers. It was called the Close the Revolving Door Act of 2019. And it was bipartisan. It was sponsored by 2 Democrats and it was sponsored by 2 Republicans. And they were trying to stop this idea that former government employees could become revolvers. Unfortunately, it was sent to committee after it was introduced and it never made it out of the committee. So that Congress never had an opportunity to actually vote on whether or not to stop revolvers. It's not likely that legislation would have passed because the Close the Revolving Door Act of 2019 would have restricted Congress members' ability to seek employment after they leave public service. And we know people generally don't pass legislation or vote on laws that are going to be to their own detriment. Okay, so how are lobbyists, one of the ways that our lobbyists can influence our government is through campaign contributions. And it's well known that lobbyists are expected to contribute financially to either the election campaigns of our sitting members of Congress or of our government, or to their pet project that they have in their constituencies. This money, the campaign contributions provides the interest groups with access. There have been several elected officials that have openly admitted that if an interest group does not contribute to them financially, then they will not even agree to meet with them. So we see that access is bought through campaign contributions. We see a lot of times money that's being donated is being donated at the request of an elected official. There's implicit and sometimes explicit threats from elected officials that say, look, if you don't fund my project in my home constituency, then I'm not going to meet with you. I'm not going to support your legislation. So what that looks like, let's say here in Whittier, we need more streetlights. And so the Whittier city budget doesn't have money allocated for streetlights. We need them, but we don't have money for them. So what might happen is one of our representatives might say to a lobbyist, hey, if you want to meet with me, if you want me to consider your piece of legislation, I need streetlights in the city of Whittier. And we need about, $1 million for streetlights. So if you could find a way to help me come up with $1 million for these streetlights, then we can meet and we can talk about your legislation. And so what the lobbyists will then contribute, $1 million to the city of Whittier for these streetlights. And then our elected official, even though they weren't the ones that directly, got the streetlights or allocated the money, will come in and say, look, as your elected official, I'm responsive to your needs. I knew we needed streetlights. And so I was able to get those streetlights funded through this organization because it benefits all of us. So those indirect campaign contributions aren't going directly to the candidate, but are going to things that are going to make the candidate look good to try and encourage people to continue to vote for that particular candidate. We have political action committees, and these are private groups that are set up to influence our government by raising funds for their members. So instead of them giving money, sometimes they give money directly to the candidates, but they also use that money that's being raised to support the candidate. So they might give, the maximum campaign contributions to that particular candidate. And once they've given that campaign contribution, then what they're going to do is they'll take that extra money and they'll run TV ads, or they'll run propaganda campaigns or social media campaigns, or they'll do those pet projects for the politicians to try and convince the people to vote for that politicians. So what we see is politicians are rewarded by the interest groups for past support. Maybe they helped pass a piece of legislation in the last congressional term, so they're going to continue to fund them to try and get them reelected. And it's also given to sort of encourage future electoral support as well. Okay, so lecture review question number 4. How do interest groups reward politicians for past support, and how do they incentivize future support? All right. So let's take a look at the amount of money that lobbyists have spent in lobbying our government from 1998 to 2023. So we're going over a 25-year span here. And we see, if we go back to 1998, the amount of money that lobbyists were spending, about $1.5 billion, which is still a lot of money by 1998 terms. But that's how much money. To give you an idea of how much money that was, I got my first job probably in 1997, 1998, and I was making $5 an hour. So to have them spending $1.5 billion lobbying our government, that is a huge amount of money in 1998. If we fast forward to 2003, we see that there is over $4 billion being spent currently to try and lobby our government. So that's a ton of money. In 2023, there were almost 13,000 lobbyists spending that $4.25 billion. If we look at government, we've looked at Open Secrets has looked at the lobbying spending, and they've seen that the growth started in 2017 and it's continued now until 2023. We saw that lobbying flattened out a little bit during the COVID-19 pandemic when a lot of industries were closing down. And then it spiked up in 2021 to where we are at now in 2023. Since the turn of the millennium, so in 2000, we pretty much have doubled the amount of spending and the number of lobbyists that we have here in the United States. So if we look at the lobbying firms that spent the most in the year 2020, Akin Gump was one of the ones that spent the most. They had about $49.87 million that they were spending lobbying our government. Behind them, they had, Brownson Hired et al., big CR group, which were also spending, $48.37 million, $31 million. Akin Gump has consistently been ranked as one of the top law firms in the United States by the American Lawyers. And they spend all this money trying to influence our government. So let's take a look really quick at Akin Gump. In 2019, it had 233 clients, and they brought in revenue of about $42.8 million. Now, of the employees at Akin Gump, we see that they have 67 lobbyists that are registered. Of those, 3 are former members of Congress, and 45 of them are revolvers, meaning they worked for the bureaucracy, they worked for, for congressional members, and then they went to work for Akin Gump to try and lobby our government. If we look at their top 10 clients and how much they paid to retain them, to advocate for them, their top client is the Gila River Indian community, which gave them about almost $1.5 million to lobby for casinos and for gambling. Partnership to Address Global Emissions, which is oil and gas, lobbied $1.28 million. Argentum Creek Partners, which is securities and investments, gave $540 million. Qualcomm gave $460 million. So we're seeing lots and lots of money being spent by these different industries to hire Akin Gump to go in and lobby on their behalf. Now, if they're giving this much money to Akin Gump, it's because Akin Gump is efficient and that they're getting results for what they're doing. All right. So the amount of money being funneled into our government has been a concern for many, many years. We looked at this chart in our last lecture on chapter 9 when we looked at political parties, which details the amount of money that can be given to particular candidates, to our national committees, our state committees, and everyone else. So we want to focus here on the PACs. So we have the political action committees, the multi-candidates, the non-multi-candidates, and so the PACs are basically interest groups that are raising funds to be able to contribute to the campaigns. So we see that there's limits on how much the PACs can contribute. They can give $5,000 per election for a candidate, $5,000 per year to the non-connected PAC committee, $15,000 per year to the national committee, and $45,000 a year to the national party committees. So they're able to funnel all this money into our elected officials trying to influence them. Now we see PACs also have the ability to do not just give money directly to the candidates, but to do, they do electoral support on their own. So they're going to run their own commercials. They're going to run their own, social media accounts. They're going to, sponsor different events and those sorts of things to try and raise money for the candidate of their choice. What we saw was Congress time and time again has tried to limit the amount of money that these groups can spend on our government. We had throughout the 1980s and the 1990s, there was what we called a soft money loophole, where there was a cap on how much they could spend on campaign contributions to different candidates. However, if they were giving money to the campaign itself or to the political party for what they called party building activities, and it wasn't being money given directly to the candidate for campaigning, then there were no limits on how much those different private companies could contribute to soft money or to party building. So the companies and lobbyists were using that as a loophole to give unlimited amounts of money to support the candidates and the parties that favored them. So in 2002, with the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act, they shut down that ability to give that soft money. So they restricted the ability of companies to give money for campaign building. And so, that's going to be considered money towards a candidate. So it limited how much money they could give to candidates, basically cutting off their ability to buy or influence our candidates. So what they did in response to that was they then created what we call 527 organizations, which were able to spend, their tax exempt groups that were able to spend unlimited amounts of money on supporting a candidate, so long as they didn't coordinate with that candidate. So I could raise all this money, and as long as my political action committee didn't coordinate with a candidate and say, hey, we're going to run this ad, you run this ad, what information do you want us to include, those sorts of things, where they operated completely independent of the candidate, there were no limits on how much money they could spend. Well, the companies and corporations didn't like the fact that they had to do these 527 organizations. They wanted to be able to continue to give money to the candidates of their choice. So they challenged that in a case called Citizens United in 2010, where the Supreme Court took a look at it and said, look, the government can't prohibit individual companies from political spending. So corporations, unions have the right to be able to contribute to political candidates because their campaign contributions, the giving of money to support a candidate, is going to be the equivalent of free speech. When you give money to support someone, your money is the equivalent of you saying, I endorse this person, I support this person. So since it's an endorsement or support, the Supreme Court considered that to be free speech and said, look, we can't limit that type of speech. So that it brought down the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act and got U.S. government from being able to restrict the amount of money that political action committees were able to now contribute to these different campaigns. It was a split decision, 5-4, so it was a mixed court that decided this. It wasn't unanimous. And what we've seen as a result of Citizens United is lobbyists, different companies and corporations have been able to increase the amount of money they're giving to our elected officials, thereby increasing the support and the influence they have over our elected officials. So if we look at the amount of money that was spent by super PACs between 2010 and 2018, we're looking at $2.9 billion being spent. If we go back to the entire cost of the 2000 election, so after 10 years after Citizens United, we see that $3.1 billion was spent on the election in 2000. When we poll the United States population, 3 in 4 believe that there should be limits on election spending that support restricting the amount of money that can be spent on campaigns. The number of super PACs that we had in 2012, right after Citizens United, compared to the number of super PACs that we had in 2016, almost doubled. We went from 1,275 to 2,393 super PACs. So we've seen that, the impact of Citizens United has been that the number of political action committees and super PACs has dramatically increased, which has dramatically increased the amount of campaign contributions and fundings our elected officials are receiving, which in turn means that these PACs are now having more influence over our government. So if we take a look at these two charts, it goes through PACs in 2010 when Citizens United was handed down versus 2020, our most, the election in 2020. And we see that, in terms of money being raised in 2009, so that was a year before the 2010 election. And then if we go, that was the year before Citizens United was handed down. And then we go to the 2020 election. We see PACs in 2009 raised about 22 million, almost $23 million for these campaigns. If we look at the PACs in 2020, that number, we're now at $14 billion in change being raised by PACs to support our candidates. So this dramatic jump in a period of a matter of 10 years, where it's astronomically higher, shows the influence that PACs have, the amount of money that they're spending influencing our government. To take this into perspective, if you saved $100,000 a year, let's say you had $100,000 a year and you put it to a savings account, it would take you 140 years to save $14 billion. So that's the amount of money being spent by PACs to lobby and influence and support our candidates here in the United States. If we were to take that $14 billion and put it towards, say, our federal deficit, or put it towards things like housing for homeless, or, drug rehabilitation, or, aid for our veterans, we would be, that money, in my opinion, could be spent in much, much better ways as opposed to simply lobbying our government. So again, think about that, you guys. When we're looking at these PACs after Citizens United, they are spending $14 billion to influence our government and our elected officials. Okay, we look at PACs and the 2020 and the 2024 elections. We see, the candidates typically that spent the most amount of money are the ones that are going to win. If we look, this was, the 2020 election cycle, Republican National Committee spent $3.78 million. Trump Make America Great Again spent $3.26 million. Democratic National Committee spent $1.79 million. Trump Victory, so forth. So we see money being spent not just by the Democratic National Committee or by the Republican National Committee. We see these PACs, the second biggest spender was the Trump super PAC, Trump Make America Great Again. Non-party committees, we see that there's the Senate Majority PACs, there's Emily's List, these different ones, these Democratic ones that were spending tons of money. We look at June of 2023, when the election was just sort of kicking up and they were trying to determine who the candidate for each individual party was going to be. And we look at the amount of money that was being spent by these super PACs to try and promote their candidate for office. The Ron DeSantis Never Back Down PAC had $96.8 million it was spending to try and get him to be the presidential nominee. Donald Trump's super PAC had $30.8 million. Nikki Haley had $17.1 million. So again, tons and tons of money being spent to try and promote candidates. And once you when that money is spent, it's done with the expectation that those candidates, once they're elected into office, are going to pass legislation, pass policies that are going to be favorable to these different organizations.